So welcome to the fourth session of our conference, and welcome the moderator, Jan Hagemejer.
Okay, so the topic of today's session is Europe GVCs in the post-COVID world, and I can already see our great speakers that we're going to have today. And this is, let me just introduce them very briefly. So we have Daria Taglioni, who is a research manager at Trade and International Integration Development Research Group at the World Bank. Previously, she worked at the ECB and OECD. We have also Michael Landesmann, who is a senior research associate and used to be a scientific director of the VIV, which is the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. And he's also a former professor of economics at the Kepler University. And we also have Wing Wu, who is a distinguished professor of economics at University of California in Davis, and also a research professor at Sunway University in Kuala Lumpur, where he heads the Jeffrey Cheek Institute on Southeast Asia and Jeffrey Sachs Center on Sustainable Development. So going back to the organization of our session, I will make a short introduction on the topic, and then I will ask my speaker to comment on some pressing issues that we have to discuss today. So the case 30 years sort of overlaps with what has been happening in the world economy and shaping the organization of world's production as we can observe it now. And this means moving away from product level comparative advantage based trade to trade based on advantages in tasks. So of course, if we look more closely on the EU, this has been a major driver of international competitiveness of the European Union for many years now. So this was mainly possible due to offshoring production to lower cost suppliers and freeing up resources in the EU to more productive uses, the ones that produce more value added per unit of output. But when we look at the Central and Eastern Europe, this is also a period that's very important to us because that's where our market economy has been shaping. And what the CEE countries have done over this time was complete reorientation towards international trade, liberalization of their economies, and also commitment to integration with the West of Europe that basically was made in the mid-90s. And this commitment in the form of the pre-accession agreements in fact, allowed these countries to benefit from a great deal of opening up. That included, for example, the inflow of FDIs and integration with the GVCs, with the European GVCs, that allowed them to produce goods and also services that would not have been otherwise possible due to lack of the access to technological advances and so on. So, I mean, there is a lot of evidence on productivity spillovers from foreign capital, both in general on aggregate to the economies, but also to the actual domestic firms from the foreign firms. So, of course, I mean, this was also, it had quite important growth implications. So for some countries, such as Poland, we could calculate the contribution of exports of value added to the growth of the GDP, and it was over the large part of the transition process between 1995 to 2014. It was roughly half of all economic growth, and in Slovakia, and Czech Republic it was more like 2/3. Of course, from the point of view of the Western economies, it was also beneficial because they could diversify the sources of intermediate goods, which are the predominant export product of the CEs, not only to Asia but also to closer sources. But when we look at on the future of this sort of cooperation, of course, there is a problem of the fact that these reasons why the capital was flowing into these Central and Eastern European economies are sort of deteriorating over time. So first is the wage advantage. When you look at the data over the last decade, we can see that in manufacturing, the unit labor costs of the CE countries compared to those in the Western Europe, this advantage has dropped by roughly 50%. But also, in general, things started to go wrong around 2008 and 2009, when we've got, of course, the global financial crisis, and since then the global trade has been stalling. But for the CEs, what it meant was also a lot of unfavorable effects, such as the bullwhip effect, which is the amplification of the shocks along the global value chains, which was particularly hurtful to the economies like Czech Republic and Slovakia. But then, of course, you have also stalling multilateral liberalization with the failure of the Doha Round, and also the activity in say bilateral liberalization is to some extent dying out over time. So there has been some discussion about possible reshoring of global value chains since probably already 2010, 2011. So, of course, we have the US, who actually started introducing policies for reshoring under Donald Trump, under the bringing back jobs argument. Whether this argument is valid is not really clear, because you actually when you do reshore, you actually lose a lot of efficiency, and that also might have a detrimental effect on the jobs. But there are some other valid arguments for reshoring. And what was already said, one is environmental protection, and of course we know that offshoring can lead to a phenomenon called carbon leakage, where multinationals tend to relocate the most polluting production to countries where the environmental regulations are the most lax. So when you look at the European Green Deal, and this was also already mentioned, we've got the initiatives called the carbon adjustment tax, which is basically a carbon tariff. So this is one of the reasons why some reshoring might be, in fact, taking place, and also, of course, it might also take place endogenously through the danger of further extreme events, which already have happened in the past. Of course, not at the scale of the COVID-19, but for example, we had the floods in Thailand that suddenly paralyzed the parts of the computer industry due to the shortages in hard drives, but nothing like the effects of COVID-19. But then, so COVID-19 is of course a factor, and what we see is that the whole idea of just-in-time processing collapsed, at least for some time, during the first phases of the COVID, because of physical restrictions into traveling and to shipping. But right now, what we observe is we have skyrocketing prices of shipping, and this greatly translates to the increase in the costs of maintaining the global value chains. And as a last argument, of course, there is China, that has emerged as a third global value chain hub over the last 10, 15 years. And also China is very much politically, so to say, different than what we like to have all around us. And the policymaker, to some extent, can think of China trying to exert some of its policies on the rest of the world through limiting the access to the vital components of the production processes. So there is some discussion about whether we should have more of a strategic open autonomy, which is the EU term, of relocation that consists mainly of relocation of the vital industries back to the EU. At this point, I think it would be good to move on to our speakers, and I would like to start with Daria and ask on her opinion, based on her research, to what extent this reshoring will take place. Daria, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. And also thanks for inviting me here. And I really wanted to come to Warsaw. So sorry to be doing it remotely. So a lot has been said, both by Beata in the Q&A and by Yuyan. So I will inevitably repeat some of the arguments that were made. But just for the sake of completeness, I think that it will be different from different sectors. And there are basically different factors that affect that. And I think by and large, one is technology. The other will be indeed, what happens to transport cost. And there it separates in two branches. What happens to transport cost because of uncertainty, and in this case, right now, the prolonged uncertainty that we're seeing for the aftermath of the pandemic, but then, as you said, also the climate change. And then really, I think there is a component of politics and policies that will shape trade costs. But on technology, so first of all, one industry that I've been looking at for quite some time now pretty closely is the high-tech industry, smartphones, and the entire ecosystem. And that industry, there is no way that is going to move. The industry, we coined a term that we call massive modularity for this industry. And it means really that even the giants that we tend to think that are almighty, like Google, Facebook, Apple, they sit on the shoulders of other giants that we do not suspect. Companies probably not many have heard about, like Murata in Japan or ARM in the UK, and these ones have complete ecosystems. And so basically, and they're specialized in such niche areas, and their value depends on being embedded in the entire ecosystem. That is very difficult. It's a very complex and entropic system, so it's very difficult to go and think. No way policymakers, with the type of very rudimentary tools they have, can really go and think into this system. They can just increase a bit the cost, but the way these industries are organized, I think we will see them staying globalized for a long time. What we will see, however, which we've been seeing already for quite some time, it's an increasing concentration of actors within each of these segments. And so that's one issue that we need to keep watching. This idea that, we see a lot of concentration within even narrowly defined sectors. Now, coming out of that world of, let's say, the frontier of technology, and coming into the broader production. So what we see on technology, it's, I think, something that on balance is also likely to continue to be a force for globalization. And by globalization, I really include also nearshoring. I think the balance, whether it's going to be far shoring or near shoring, ultimately will be the cost of production, right? But basically, we see that many of the new technologies like artificial intelligence and robots, surely they increase the incentives to move back industrial production close to the consumer. That's effect is partly there. But by doing that, we also see that there are many other forces that actually induce us to think that that these technologies, and in particular artificial intelligence, will expand opportunities for exports from developing countries, both in manufacturing and in services. So in manufacturing, just to name a couple of examples, you have smart robots and other artificial intelligence enabled technology that help optimize process, they help forecast demand, and they assist in managing the supply chains. And so it's all elements that increase the incentives to source where the costs are more effective. On the service side, you have machine translation and other similar applications that reduce the trade cost and facilitate communication. And also, in this period of pandemic, many companies have invested in improving the remote working abilities. And so we have a huge increase in the availability of skilled labor that we have already observed since 2020. And so that is going to continue. And last but not least, obviously, which companies will benefit will also depend on the companies that have, the countries that will benefit will be the ones that have probably a good data policy. So in this sense, the Eastern European countries probably will benefit. So that's for uncertainty. Another point that I want to make is that we've observed what companies in countries do following shocks. And one thing that we learned from the global crisis is that actually companies tend to adjust at the intensive margin of trade. So it's a completely different decision to offshore and to reshore. There is much more hysteresis in once the fixed cost of offshoring has been done. And so that's also another element that I think as researchers we need to study more, but also speaks in favor of thinking that we won't see a dramatic revolution. Now, the uncertainty, you mentioned the uncertainty. It's true that it's fascinating to see all the disruptions to the supply chain for someone like me that has been working on this value chain topics for 10 years now. And I think it's astounding. I mean, a 40-foot container from Asia to North America was priced at $2,000 in November, and then by spring was at $9,000. And we have the reliability of shipment that dropped from 75% reliability pre-pandemic in 2019 to 35% now. So we have a lot of uncertainty, and obviously the more this uncertainty will last, the more companies will look for alternative strategies. I mean, this is just really the optimal stopping problem of the investing under uncertainty. And so, of course, I think a key determinant on that will be how effectively policy will be in convincing firms that they are solving the problem. And so ultimately, I say that the answer is that I do not know if the reshoring will take place on a large scale, because I really think that politics and policies climate change is one issue, but also, the recent wave of populism, as one of the last questions in the speech of Beata mentioned, might play a role in trying to alter policies at the border. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think that's actually very interesting, and maybe we can leave that for further discussion. But the question that came to my mind is to what extent politically this would be possible. I mean, if you consider the efficiency effects of global value chains, and then you try to devise a policy of reversing these allocative effects, and then you basically ask, you ask your voters, are you willing to forgo a large chunk of your income for this exercise of reshoring. That's actually a very, I would say, important problem. But I think we would like to go to Michael and ask on his opinion about how Europe will adjust to the new GVCs, new order of global GVCs, whatever it's going to be, and what is the role of EU policy in that respect.
Thank you, Jan, and let me start off also with congratulating Case for a wonderful jubilee. We are going to have, the Vienna Institute is going to follow you next year with a 50 years anniversary. And I think we also collaborated since the inception of Case on many projects together. We sometimes have different policy slants. I think Case is probably a very strongly liberal-oriented institute. We have more of a Keynesian tradition, but I think this intellectual exchange was always enriching for us, and we managed over the decades to really work together on many issues. So many congratulations. So as to your questions, I think in this intervention, I will talk more about Europe as a whole, and then talk about Central Eastern Europe more in our second round. Coming back to some of the issues which Daria started off. Well, I think we all agree that we are living through a major switch in geopolitics and geoeconomics. And I think whatever scenarios we build in terms of how international global value chains and regional value chains are going to evolve are going to be strongly affected by a number of different factors. A lot of them, I think we as economists have to be honest, we find difficult to quantify and project. And let me name three such factors to start off with. One, all of them have been mentioned, of course, but I think we might want to exploit, especially in this panel, more directly. One is, of course, geopolitics. I think we're living through a period where it seems to be almost an inverse, where politics seems to shape the global architecture more than the economics. So economics has to adjust to rather dramatic changes in politics. And I think we had a feeling over the previous decades that the opposite was true. I'm quite interested also in the other panelists to see what they think about it. I mean, this affects many things. I mean, we have seen the stalling and the tensions on the trade policy side, and of course the evolution of the US-China relationships will very strongly shape global developments, not only in their bilateral relationships, but also in regional developments all over the world. I think we have seen that changing geopolitics shifts also the policy scenarios in many of the regions. I think the concepts of regional strategic autonomy, the stronger emphasis on the role of state shaping industrial architecture, also in the form of at least a strong rhetoric and recovery of the term of industrial policy, has come back quite strongly. And of course, in many ways, we see a concern about technology transfer on capture of innovation and technological know-how within the region in which one is positioned. And I think Europe, of course, is within that context. The second factor, which again is shaping global developments, and it's a long-run factor, it's technology. And I think we've seen and we are seeing some exponential drives in certain important trajectories. So obviously, digitalization is exponentially diffusing now through many, many activities. And again, the quantification of its impact is still quite early on, and we still have a lot of work to do on that. And that goes along, of course, with areas of artificial intelligence, robotics, moving into sectors and activities which were previously much less affected by international interlinkages. Many of the areas which used to be sheltered are much more open to the impact of these technologies. In fact, a rather important contribution by Richard Baldwin in his book on robotics is trying to have an initial quantification of the impact on these previously sheltered sectors of the economy. The third factor, which we, of course, in this panel are very strongly concerned with, is what are the longer run impacts of the shock which we have just now experienced and which we are continuing to experience, the aftermath of the COVID shock, together with the experience of vulnerability, of showing up certain gaps in the industrial architectures of different regions of the world. I think it will be a continuous driver towards a much stronger emphasis on regional architecture, on regionalism. And I think we can see that in a number of sectors. So I think the point you made about the trade-off between efficiency and to some extent strategic autonomy and trying to get a higher degree of resilience will be very much shaping, I think, the way the global order is developing. Now, how does Europe position itself in it? I think there are lots of strategic decisions which are going to be made, whether they are evolving, whether they're taken explicitly, rationally, or they are driven by political processes from the bottom up is another issue. One is, of course, whether Europe and the EU specifically is joining an US-led strategic Western alliance, or it performs a sort of bridge function in a world where geoeconomics and geopolitics has quite strongly evolving conflictual elements. I think probably both trajectories will be followed, but when we speak over here in this panel about GVCs and regional production integration, I think this will be an important moment. The geopolitical decisions which Europe is making is also going to have a strong impact on the issues of what form production integration, specialization is going to form. There might be some degree of global decomposition, not in a dramatic, not in an extreme form, but the trends are likely to be there. Now, let me come to what you mentioned. I think I should say something about Europe's industrial policy. I think there has been, over the last decades, revival of debates on industrial policy. And I think in the type of global setting which I was describing, I think it's going to continue to have a strong emphasis. On an intellectual level, it was a fertile debate. I think there were many interesting new concepts developing out of this revival of interest in industrial policy. On the regional level, the concepts such as smart specialization were developing. There was a thinking to learn from problems with the old style of industrial policy, which were sort of key sector oriented, more in the direction of technological trajectories. There's an emphasis on bottom up approaches, search procedures, which involves a lot of stakeholders in developing industrial policy strategies. And of course, there's also this more ambitious idea of grand designs of shaping industrial developments, like the New Green Deal in Europe, which is sort of borrowing, I think, from Mazzucato's mission-oriented industrial policy concept. So also, we see increasingly that there's an intertwining between positions on trade policy issues and industrial policy and climate policy, as was already mentioned with the tax on the CBAM, which is the community border adjustment mechanism. So I think one area which I want to emphasize, which is an unresolved issue in the European policy architecture, is the relation between competition policy and industrial policy. In principle, they can be quite conflictual, and we know that competition policy was one of the big achievements at the EU level, because it really provided a way of breaking down national entry barriers and trying to really push very much against incumbent capturing of markets, and I think this was very welcome. On the other hand, we also see that industrial policy has a long-term ambition actually to build up certain industries and support certain technological trajectories, and I think it might be seen as conflictual. I think a lot of also intellectual and policy thinking has to be done in which way we can make competition policy, industrial policy complementary to each other. I think it's an unresolved issue. Scale in today's global environment is important, but it is of course also important that large companies operate efficiently and do not exploit unduly their market power. But I think there's a lot of evolution in that. I think I should come to an end. There are many other areas of policymaking in the European Union which infringe on this cluster of issues of how to position oneself in the global environment. Obviously, areas which mean a further deepening of single market integration, financial market integration, the building up and continuous emphasis on innovation capabilities and coordination and across the European space is important, as is to exploit the development potential in the neighboring regions, including non-European neighboring regions like the Middle East and Northern Africa, which somehow is also linked with attitudes of migration policy. Overall, I think I would take an optimistic view on Europe's position in this global environment. Europe is a very heterogeneous continent. The space for actually doing regional value chain, as was already happening over the last decades, is very strong because we have a lot of wage differentiation, productivity differentiation, skill differentiation, and I think companies can exploit this differentiation in a closed geographic environment. So in some sense, Europe is rather well positioned. The weaknesses, of course, are in terms of coming to a very good and quick strategic policy making, which was always the weakness, I think, of a difficult European policy making experiment, European integration experiment, which we are still trying to understand also over the next decades. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Given this great heterogeneity of Europe, we could think that coming to a consensus on the shape of this industrial policy, common industrial policy, would be very difficult, right? I mean, every country in the EU might, in fact, think about its own strategic sectors that would need to be, so to say, reshored, and then coming up with a consensus on how to shape the overall policy would actually be a little bit of a challenge, at least in my opinion. Anyway, I think that we'd like to move on to Wing Wu and ask about his views on how will the GVCs work in the post-COVID period, in particular taking into account the increasing role of China and the trade tensions between the major players, including China. Please, Wing Wu, the floor is yours. I think you're muted. Please unmute yourself.
Sorry. I joined the other two panelists in congratulating CASE in the celebration of its 30th anniversary. This is the case of successful infant industry, a think tank that has now reached world-class status. And I must say, it is not something that happens easily, as is evident from Asian think tanks that have been in existence longer. what we saw happened in international trade during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic were two things. One, that there was a shortage of emergency medical supplies because the countries producing it decide that it ought to have first dip in the products produced on its own territory. And so, like as simple a thing as a face mask, China had a temporary ban on the export of face masks, causing a shortage in Japan and most of East Asia. The second thing is, even if the countries had not resorted to protectionism to give itself medical preferential treatment, there was also disruption in transportation, shipping, air flights. So there was a big disruption to production all over the world, especially since in the modern supply chain, everything is done on the basis of just-in-time delivery. So what's if we envisage such pandemics to become more frequent in the future? We have what we do depends on balancing two costs. One is all of us now hold larger inventories of goods. So there's storage cost. Versus we onshore, we extend subsidies to certain industries so that they produce locally. There is an efficiency cost on the other hand. So which happens depends on how a country weighs these two costs. And in a sense, the market could actually respond rationally because a businessman would see that if he were to make an investment in storage, he could end up maximizing long-run profits. So this is something that you don't necessarily need a state solution where the state offers a subsidy for the industry to be reshored. The market itself could correct it. All of this realignment of the supply chain, in my opinion, will pale in comparison to the unraveling of international trade that we see now from the geostrategic competition that Michael Landesmann just talked about. We have had free trade that brought about great economic prosperity throughout the world, but this free trade occurred in a stable environment that was stable because we were living in a hegemonic world order. We have what Kinderberger would say, hegemonic stability. There was one country with overwhelming military and political ability to enforce its views on its members. And the US would say, to their benefit as well. And in return, the US not only largely designed the system, the US would also occasionally unilaterally amend the system as it sees fit. The best example would be the global monetary system. We had the US dollar being the linchpin of the world monetary system instead of Keynes's Bangkok. And when Nixon decided to close the gold window, he did it unilaterally without asking anybody about it. But the question we have now is, how do we preserve free trade in a world of multilateral powers? Multipolar world. Sorry, not multilateral. I apologize. How can we prevent the two big powers from engaging, from suffering from a bout of bipolar disorder? Basically, what we see is that national security concerns have to be added now, have to be addressed if we are to keep multilateral trading system. The U.S. solution to the emergence of China has been to hold the Chinese down technologically. The policies against Huawei and other Chinese high-tech companies comes from the belief that China is a security threat because it's catching up technologically. Whereas I think as economists, we would believe that the right solution is not to try to hold down the other side technologically, but to build up your own ability to accelerate technological innovation on your side. That's the way, that is a win-win solution to both. Now, would the US be able to impose technological isolation of China? That would depend very much on Europe's choice, largely because Europe is an independent technological innovator. And of course, no innovations. Innovations are usually accelerated when there is competition and collaboration. So the question is, if Europe chooses to be open to both sides, and I think then we will continue to have the preservation of free trade that has brought prosperity to the world. And not only is it just Europe plays the important role, the other role that will be increasingly be important would be the actions of present US allies in East Asia, Japan, and Korea. Whether they see the Chinese market as something that is more of an advantage than to be something to be afraid of. So I think that we have to talk about how do we design a trade system that is mostly free in a multipolar world. Well, clearly, as I said, we need to address the national security concerns. We need to have come to an agreement about industrial policy, largely because the competition in national security and in economics rests heavily on technological upgrading in each of the major powers. So we believe, as an economist, we believe in competition being good. And the problem is the present US strategy consists of suppressing technological competition with China. How could we set up a system? I think that would be the second round questions, such that we are able to address the difficulties of preserving free trade in a multipolar world. One thing for sure, we don't want the Chinese to imitate the Americans. The Americans have 800 military bases in 7 countries in the world, 70 countries in the world. If the Chinese were also to have 800 military facilities in 70 countries, the potential for accidents is just too high. We cannot risk that. And does it mean that we have to settle for spheres of influence as a world of spheres of influence, but with multilateral free trade? I'll stop here. Thank you.
So, as already indicated by the speakers, we have a second round of questions. And the first one I would like to direct to Michael, asking more specifically about the Central and Eastern European countries and the way they're going to adjust to these post-COVID changes in GVCs. And also, ask about the role of the neighborhoods of the EU, in particular the candidate countries in this process. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan. And I also want to thank the previous speakers and especially Professor Wu, which definitely motivates to have a much stronger dialogue between Europe and Asian speakers, both policymakers, but also academics, to get a clear view in terms of strategic choices which are to be made in policymaking in Europe. I think it is vital given the development at the global level. And I'm sure we will come back to a debate about these issues when we open up for a fuller discussion. Well, you asked me now about Central Eastern Europe. I think GVCs, I think Daria was already talking about that, and Jan, in your introduction, GVCs were extremely important for Central and Eastern European countries after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Basically, the Central European countries, they basically, it facilitated their reindustrialization. There was a huge industrial shock in the first phase of transition. And I think basically it was cross-border production networks which allowed these countries to become, by now, an industrial hub in Europe as a whole, linked, of course, to the other major industrial hub, which is Germany, and to some extent also some other country like Switzerland, Austria, Northern Italy, etc. in Europe. So I think one can't underscore the importance of regional GVCs, the linkages to Western European industrial hubs of Central Eastern countries, and of course indirectly, therefore, also to global GVCs, because Germany is, of course, strongly globally connected. There were some snags in building up the whole process of industrial development on the development of value chains, basically driven by foreign investors. I think it was more or less one gave up domestic policy initiatives. I think it was so successful to rely on foreign investment to bring about an upgrading of industrial structures, building up of capacities, skill upgrading to some extent. One of the snags was, of course, it accentuated very strong regional uneven development in many of the CECs. I think FDI has a tendency to utilize the benefits of agglomeration. So you find a lot of the locations of these production networks on the western borders of the CECs and to some extent in the capital cities, but it really accentuated regional uneven development. So there was a strong concentration. I think by now many contributors reacted to these developments, partly because FDI flows don't take such a prominent role anymore, but also because Central European countries have moved up the ladder to extent that it can't rely purely on external technology transfer, but it's important to build up one's own capabilities in technology, in innovation. I think one can think of the contributions by Taglioni and others who say you have to change your policy setting when you move more towards the frontier. So I think there is a rethinking on the policymaking structures, on how to make sure you don't get stuck in low value added areas of value chains. The importance of, again, skill upgrading, vocation training, and the importance also of diversification, because a part of the industrial development processes in many of the Central European countries was a very strong focus on specialized industries, car manufacturing in particular. And of course, it's a continuous theme throughout this conference, the quality of legal and other institutional features which are important. Then we come to the candidate countries. I mean, we can generally say Central Europe is probably almost globally specific, very, very strong complementary area in which value chains played a very important role. Candidate countries are in a much more difficult situations. And if you think further west and also south, further east and further south, what will be happening to the next wave of countries. We can see some nascent positive developments in countries like Serbia, North Macedonia, and of course also Romania had quite a strong catching up in linking up to production networks, but it's not pervasive in neighboring areas. So I think we know quite a few of the factors which could accelerate this process and factors which are holding it back. I mean, we know that for the Central European countries, the prospect of accession and then accession played, of course, a very major role. So the sort of limbo state in which candidate countries are now in the waiting room for a long, long time, and neighboring countries is obviously a very problematic situation. And I think the EU has to think very carefully what process can take place while in the waiting room, which can mimic to some extent the importance. The second important factor, which we know is very relevant, is to break up barriers across very small market segments. I mean, the Western Balkans, but of course also countries in the East, the Caucasus countries, suffer from the smallness of their entities, both for setting up production facilities which need to integrate, but of course also for an extensive market. So I think market integration, even if you're not yet part of the EU and converging towards the form of market setup which we see in the EU, is very important. Thirdly, another theme which was taken up in this conference in a number of contributions is the difficulty with losing an important segment of the professional and highly skilled part of the workforce who rather substantial migration flows. It is very important not only from those countries, but also from the EU side, to think very carefully about migration patterns which try to avoid a unidirectional brain drain, but to make sure that there is some circularity, there's some return migration, there's a building up of joint facilities, of building up education and training structures which benefit both sides. Finally, I think there is an important factor which we see in many of the countries, candidate countries, and countries also further east. There's a danger of exchange rate overvaluation, which partly is linked, of course, to the dependency on remittances. So a lot of purchasing power coming in without at the same time building up production facilities. Economic development, as you know, as we all agree, is highly dependent, of course, also on institutional political conditions. And these might move in some examples in the right direction, but in many other areas in the wrong direction. Overall, nonetheless, I'm optimistic because given the geo-economic setup, I already mentioned before, the importance for Europe to exploit its internal differentiation will to some extent benefit candidate countries as long as these other factors are dealt with major policy initiatives. So I think the post-COVID situation does open up opportunities for candidate countries, neighboring regions, to link up more closely with wider European economic developments. I'm sure there will be a continuous debate on the reshoring possibilities, but I think the possibilities, the potential does exist. The question is whether the internal policy setup and the political processes are making use of that. So overall, Europe, although I'm not a great fan of regionalization, which happens in the global development at the moment, but I think to some extent you can say that developments in the eastern region of Europe could, in principle, be a beneficiary of these developments. Thank you, Jan.
Thanks a lot. Of course, there's always a question. There's always the question whether more reshoring would mean, so to say, more factors that will make the CE stay in the role of the factory Europe, right? I mean, whether these factors will to some extent limit the growth potential in these countries, but by locking them in these so to say low cost production facilities. But of course, that's something that we don't really know at this moment, as let's say other areas such as let's say innovative activity, for example, are lagging behind in those countries. So it's really not clear whether there is an alternative. But I would like to turn to Daria and ask about the role of EU climate policies and also maybe the circular economy policies that are present and more prominent in the EU, and what would be the effect of those on what's going to happen in Europe. Please.
Yeah, so I think that first of all, the circular economy policies and climate are really two twins. The EU is as an equal share in the world trade of dirty goods and of materials that need to be targeted by circular economy policies, and in both cases they represent like around 9% of the world trade. So I think what's happening really, it's that the EU is taking a bet, is precisely to open an area. I mean, if we look at the reflection of these climate change policies for the competitiveness and the value chains of EU, is taking the bet of investing in technologies that are still for the most part expensive, by basically fostering more production, more consumption, more use, and more financing of these technologies, and in doing so, pushing the abatement of the cost of production of these technologies, and also, perhaps thinking at some point the climate crisis and the fact that we are running out of resources, according to some, in a matter of a couple of decades, if we do not change from linear to circular modes of production, will mean that the rest of the world will have to follow. And if the EU will have won its bet, it will be basically at the frontier of the competitiveness of new industries, export these technologies, export standards. But I think most importantly now, it's also the consideration that they can revive indeed the EU economy domestically. So I think the scenario one is indeed that this bet is won, these technologies are abated, and basically the green economy becomes a new engine of growth. And I think perhaps the most successful antecedent to that is what has happened with the solar panels. So it was, I don't know if some remember, but back in the early 2000s, McKinsey had produced a chart with all the pro-environment green technologies and the abatement curves. And actually, solar panels were considered one of those where it was better not to bet on, because the unit cost for production was too high, although it was recognized that they had good abatement potential. But what they didn't anticipate is indeed the markets at work. And what happened was that there was massive incentives in two EU countries, especially Germany and Spain. Others also gave important incentives, but really the German and the Spanish incentives were the biggest. And then China, that at the time wasn't really yet embracing the green technology, but was looking for opportunities to produce large-scale simple technologies, started investing, took this policy signal as the promise that a new area would develop, and invested massively. And so we ended up basically having a huge abatement cost in the solar technology, so much so that we now put it also on gadgets. So I think this is really the bet that the EU is trying to do. And it's a difficult one, because then there is the second scenario, as you mentioned, the problem of leakage. And so you mentioned leakage, and I think you refer to the standard one, that is the leakage based on differences on competitiveness, meaning the relocation of EU production in other jurisdictions that have a more lax environmental law. But then there are other two channels that are really important. One is the leakage that happens through change in prices, and which basically could eventually, in the worst scenario, make the price of dirty technology so low that even the EU doesn't transition. Because if the work prices of these things become so low, then if the tax wouldn't compensate the drop in price, and so actually there could be a lock-in into dirty technologies. And then the third type of leakage that is very important, especially in the context of this discussion, is the one through value chain, meaning I tax the dirty good, but I do not tax the downstream goods because it gets very quickly too complicated. And then what I do, what I end up with is that I get leakage of the downstream products, and so I basically hurt the European firms' competitiveness. So how do we? So I think it's a tricky moment, and how do we go about it? I think that the key is that the decision, the policy decision, and the policy process of implementing, let's call it this waste tax, just that embraces the carbon tax and embraces the taxes around materials, has to be decisive, has to be fast, and without progressivity in adoption. It has to give a clear signal to the actors, to the consumers, to the producers, and to the financial markets that this is an industry that is here to stay. Because that's the only way we will get to the abatement in cost that can unleash the positive effects. Otherwise, we will only see these negative effects. And as I said, in the worst case, we will have lock-in into polluting technologies. And obviously, and here I link it up probably with what Wing was saying, it cannot be done without a supportive trade diplomacy and trade agreements and and collaboratively. And so the trade policy becomes more important than ever, and it both at the bilateral and at the multilateral level. So I wouldn't say, I'm not sure how feasible Wing is the idea of thinking of spheres of influence, because I think actually the points of contacts are so complex and so diverse in each specific case that you would almost have to have customized spheres of influences for different topics, items. So that's, I think the big challenge of the next years is really, for Europe, is to convince Europe that can't do it alone. It needs to really use its trade diplomacy to support this shift, and then that there is no much tinkering and bickering between countries that are afraid. For instance, Eastern European countries, Poland, they are very dependent on these energy resources. They are big consumers, they are big importers. They really have to embrace this change, otherwise they will actually be the worst hit. So it has to be really one area where EU shows cohesiveness, promptness of action, and does it in the massive scale it has done with the solar panels. Thank you.
Thanks. So at the end of the day, when we think about the perspectives of reshoring for the CEs, I mean, there are some factors that will actually not make it very potentially profitable for the CEs. First one is the fact that the economies are carbon dependent in a way, and second is that we are losing competitiveness. So if we turn to automatization, even then the incentives for the production processes to relocate to the CE are not going to be very high, because you can you might as well do it in the west of Europe, where you are not dependent so much on coal. And I mean, since you are also automatizing, you don't need the cheap labor. So that's not, it's. I mean, from my point of view, these factors are sort of limiting to the potential of the benefits to relocation to Europe, I guess. But then, of course, there is this problem also with the policies that for the climate you need consensus, like a global consensus. And with the EU losing its share in the world market, its ability to push around these let's say Western values, which include also environmental protection, is to some extent diminishing. Let me turn to as the last part to Wingwu and ask. What can Europe do to maximize, Europe as a whole, to maximize the gains from the new situation, or maybe limit the losses? Please. Sorry, you're muted again.
I apologize. Before I answer your question, I would like to say that your previous statement that environmental protection is the Western value, that cannot be true. I think if you look at Eastern philosophies, living in peace with nature is possibly one of the oldest tenets in both Taoism, Hinduism. In fact, what could be more naturalistic than Hinduism, where the upper classes don't even eat meat? Anyway, but what I want to say is that this is not a matter.
I was more referring to the trade agreements of Europe, where we're trying to push environmental protection as one of the core principles. Of course, you're right concerning the Asian.
Largely, that is promotion of global public goods. It is an instrument. I do not see that as protectionism. In fact, I would say the need to transition to green technology requires us to balance two things. We need free trade so that there is synergy from competition to accelerate the emergence of green technology. But we also need state policy to get the pricing of externalities right, so that the market could move. So in a way, what is industrial policy? Industrial policy in this case is addressing the externalities that the market price would not naturally incorporate. Okay. Coming to this, how does that affect Europe maximize its economic benefits from the emerging global situation, where we have a possible bipolar disorder occurring on the world? One thing for sure is that the Europeans should offer a counter proposal to the US position that we want a rules-based global order. The European position should be, we want a global order that is based on international law, rather than rules that has been arbitrarily made up by one side or another in an age of unequal military and economic power. So that means that the establishment, the strengthening of existing global institutions like the United Nations and its agencies, and the strengthening of regional organizations like the EU, and in the case of Asia, ASEAN, that becomes more important than ever, largely because these institutions can serve as the instruments of conflict mediation, as well as suppliers of global public goods. So when I talked about spheres of influence, by that what I really meant was we ought to be able to keep economic competition separate from geostrategic competition, largely because there is a lot of confusion where the two becomes one and the same. Peter Navarro is against any trade with China at all, because trade by its nature, it occurs only when it's a win-win outcome. If it is not a win-win outcome, trade would not occur. So the fact that trade does benefit China, for him is enough not to have it. On that kind of reasoning, there should be no US-China collaboration on fighting climate change, because climate change would certainly benefit China. Because what is happening in China is the amount of rain falling in the north is decreasing, so there is a drying out, but the amount of rain falling in southern China has been increasing, so there's more floods. So what we need to do is to divide up the competition, wherein define it. What is geostrategic competition? What is economic competition? We define the instruments that could be used in each of these two spheres, such that an instrument that's used in competing in the economic sphere should not be used as a bargaining chip when it comes to geostrategic competition. Like, for example, the weaponization of the US dollar is such a case where you allow geostrategic competition to undermine the economic competition that should take place. So what that really means is that's why we need an international law-based order, because we need to formulate new rules in a world that is no longer dominated by one single power. And I think a good place to begin would be the Europeans could take such a lead in that.
Thanks a lot. So now we have still a few minutes left. So of course we're open to questions from the room, and also those of you who are watching us online can post questions on the website, and I will read them out to our speakers. So, anyone? It seems we do not have any questions, and I don't have any questions from. Yep, Michael wants to say something, please.
No, I mean, if there are no questions from the floor, I might as well. I would like to respond a bit to Professor Wu, who gave a relatively optimistic picture in this world of three or more players, yeah? Where some players can agree on this rules-based order and push the world in this direction. And I think you made this distinction between economic competition, which leads to this positive sum game through trade, and strategic competition. Unfortunately, the things are a bit more murky because when we speak about economic competition, it is strongly linked now to technology competition. Yeah, because you're positioning in international in international trade, in international specialization, is of course very much a function of your technological innovation skill positioning. Yeah, unfortunately, technology competition is also very strongly linked to military and strategic competition, because unfortunately technology has hierarchical elements in it. Yeah. So while we think as economists of economic competition being a level playing field of a horizontal nature, technology competition is much more a hierarchical game, and unfortunately this sphere is itself again linked to strategic competition. So I'm not sure how to disentangle the things, because I feel that the sphere of technological competition will be a very driving force in how global developments move. And on the other hand, of course, one of the major forces which led to miraculous, almost unprecedented catching up and alleviation of poverty globally, not unfortunately pervasive, but in important regions of the world, was the importance of free flow of know-how, of student exchanges, of the free movement of companies bringing their know-how and so on. Yeah, but I think all this is linked to a picture of technology transfer, which is somehow in conflict with hierarchical nature of technological competition and therefore strategic competition. What is your view on this rather complex picture?
Professor Wu, would you like to comment?
Michael has said is certainly true, but I think we have to, in the end, it is you have to make up your mind. What is the nature of the national security threat? And one way to think about a national security threat is that the other person is evangelical about the ideological values of his system, and is trying to spread it. That's why it is a national security threat. The truth is, I think the age of ideological evangelism is dead in most parts of the world and in most parts of the US society, except among, I would say, the extremely nationalistic Christian evangelists in the US. Given the fact that ideological evangelism is largely dead, we know that there cannot be serious national security confrontation, largely because we all have enough nuclear bombs to blow each other up several times over. So, since direct confrontation is not possible, what happens is you have proxy wars. What is the new the title of the new Cold War? The title of the new Cold War is Indo-Pacific Strategy. And what is what is keeping the Indian Ocean apart from the Pacific Ocean? Southeast Asia. This is the cockpit of the area of contestation of the new emerging Cold War. And it is also the area where they were the only way that the Southeast Asians can prevent themselves from becoming proxies to these two big powers is that they have been studying the European Union with a lot of attention, because with regional integration, it gives them agency on the international arena. Just like it is the European Union that has pushed the European Green Deal as an example to the rest of the world, such that the US has adopted it, China has adopted it. So this is the last big inspiration that Southeast Asia has drawn from the European experience, which is that if you want to become, to be able to bifurcate economic competition and geostrategic competition, we have to be able to stand up to the two sides that is trying to bribe the member countries of Southeast Asia to be on one side or the other. Largely because direct confrontation is no longer an option in this age. So because of that, I think the concerns for national security are wrongly perceived in some of capitals of the world. To think that China would attack the US without China being destroyed in turn by US retaliation is just unrealistic. So basically, whether we like it or not, there will always be peace between the two major powers, but not among members of their coalition. So I think, how do we keep the two separate? It is a very hard task, but this is what us people in think tanks are supposed to help think about, and to come to be able to have analytical demarcations, which would necessarily change over time as technological progress occurs. Because I think that where you draw the line really depends on what the state of the technology. Like if we are able to eavesdrop on each other very easily, then the whole concept of privacy, national security is a very different game. So I agree with Michael. There's no sharp, easy answer.
We actually have a question from the internet, from Mrs. Natalia Havrilishin, and it's about Russia and what's the position of Russia in the equation, given the change in geopolitical situation. This is a question to Professor Wing-Wu. We have
It is highly
a few minutes.
It is highly as long as the United States has an antagonistic relationship with China, that would draw China closer to Russia. But the two are not natural allies in many ways. But I think Russia will continue to be very important, especially in its and what it acts on the European front is going to tilt European decision of what to do in the U.S.-China confrontation. What do you think, Michael? Don't you not think how Russia acts is going to influence Europe's choices in the new Cold War?
Well, I think I agree with you that an increasing tension between China and the US will draw Russia closer to China. I think there is, let's say, economic complementarity with both regions. A country which is a major energy supplier to China and to the European Union has options open in both ways. The one problem, which of course, which is there, is the structural weakness of Russia, which might actually lead to an almost continuous decline also in its strategic importance. Yeah. So in that sense, it will be it can become an ally in one or the other direction, but with increasingly minor possibility. And I think if we think about military capability, which actually held up its position, at some point this is also linked to its economic weakness and also its behavior towards its own profession classes. Yeah. So I feel the weight of Russia in the strategic game internationally will decline.
We have 1 minute left. Daria, do you want to comment on this maybe?
No, it's fine. I think.
Okay. So, yes, Michael?
Jan, if you have a minute, I wanted to come back to some of the points you made. One was on the heterogeneity of Europe not leading to creating a problem for an industrial policy strategy at the European level. And I think to some extent, I agree with you. Like in all policy domains of the EU, it's very complicated to come to agreements because there are diverse interest positions and so on. Of course, on the other hand, you can see the EU as being an example where differences of interest are articulated and they get represented in these political processes. And I want to make another point, which I think could be seen as a positive element in the European policymaking structure, because it has three levels of governance. It has a supranational level of governance, it has the national level of governance, and it has a regional level of governance. And I think in some areas it makes things more complicated, but it also is a sort of mutual monitoring of behavior. So I think we could see that in the way how regional policy is proceeding, and I think in the way how also industrial policy would be proceeding. If there would be only the national domain, things would be much more open to capture by important interest groups. If there's an EU domain which, on the other hand, also provides certain resources, know-how, etc., there's some degree of control and moderation. It might not be that strong in some areas, but I think so. I think in that sense, you can say this governance structure at the EU with the three-level element is making things complicated, but is also to some extent a strength. And in that sense, I think if we make an EU-Asia comparison, I think it's an area where Asia is still lagging in its institutional development in terms of the governance structures on different levels. And then there's a further interesting difference between Europe and Asia. Asia now evolves clearly with a Stackelberg leading position. Yeah. So it doesn't have that strongly a multipolarity in itself. The multipolarity is coming more from outside, but not within the Asian context itself. There again, the Europe itself is by its definition, because it only has a few medium-sized powers, multipolar in itself, and has to learn the technique of dealing with multipolarity within its own structure. Thank you.
Can I have 30 seconds? I think
that would be very difficult.
I disagree with Michael say, because he has just ruled out India ever emerging to be a world power. I think that attitude towards India is what the world had towards China in 1978. I think it is a mistake to think that the Indian elephant will not fly. Thank you.
Thank you. And we need to end here. So I'd like to thank you for your acceptance of the invitation to this session, and also for I think a very interesting discussion that is very difficult to end, as you can see. And thanks a lot once again. And we're going to have a 2-minute break before the next session. Thank you.